Supreme Court Justice, Associate Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Just moments before we recorded this episode of Bill Whittle Now, I'm Scott Ott, and Bill, I listened to the roll call vote in the Senate, and with 52 votes from senators with only one Republican breaking ranks, Susan Collins of Maine, Amy Coney Barrett has been confirmed as President Trump's nominee and as the new Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. Bill, that's all I want to talk about in this episode, and kind of looking ahead. Specifically, I'd like to ask you about, and we can take each one of these in turn, what does this mean for the court, for the Constitution, for the country, and probably somewhat importantly, for the campaign? The Democrats have made a big deal about the fact that this nominee could be a threat to the right to abortion in this country, could be a threat to the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, could be a threat to even the election itself, should it get thrown to the Supreme Court. And there were a lot of questions about whether Judge Barrett would recuse herself in that situation. So let's start with what I think is the kind of short-term question in this, Bill. What do you think the effect of this nomination and confirmation just days before a presidential election will have on the remaining days in the campaign?
Well, there's three scenarios here, so let's look at each one of them. If Donald Trump wins the election and forget the civil unrest that they're already planning, if Donald Trump wins the election and is inaugurated on January 20th for another 4 years, then Donald Trump's legacy will be secure for quite a long time, decades.
48 years old is Judge Barrett.
Yeah, decades. All of them are young, all of them. And it's not just a question of, gee, this is kind of like, well, you know, a swing towards conservative values on the court. As I've said 100 times before, the left uses the Supreme Court to accomplish things that they cannot accomplish through elections and legislation. And if Donald Trump wins the election, and if the inauguration goes smoothly, then I suspect that we will have the next 4 years of a number of rulings that will increase personal liberty and, well, let me rephrase that.
Well, Bill, let me stop you for a second, because I really want to get to the effect on the remaining days of the campaign before too much about the legacy and what it could have to do, you know, with the court, the country, and the Constitution. Do you think this has any effect? Some 60 million people reportedly have already voted in this election. Does this, the Republicans charging through and doing this, does it help the Republicans? Does it hurt the Democrats, or vice versa?
I don't see that it has much of an effect, to be honest with you. I mean, it's been pretty clear that she was going to be sworn in pretty much since she was announced. This is another reason why early voting is so demonstrably terrible. I have heard that the number one search term for Google is changing your vote. The entire idea of locking down a vote before you get to the actual election day is just awful. So I can't tell you whether it's going to affect it. I suspect it probably won't. I don't think that people who've already decided to vote for Biden will suddenly change their mind because of this one way or another. I don't think it's going to bring more people out to vote for Biden. I don't think it's going to bring more people out to vote for Trump. I think it's essentially built into the dynamics of this election cycle, and I don't see the actual confirmation having a huge effect. I think the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the threat of her being replaced had some kind of measurable effect, but that's already baked into the pie now.
Okay, so going forward, as far as the legacy of President Trump, if he should win a second term, these Supreme Court justices typically sit for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. You have talked before about how conservatives aren't using the court, and you mentioned it this episode. Conservatives aren't trying to use the court to get their desired outcome. They're trying to have justices on the court who will actually read the Constitution, read the law, determine what it meant when it was written, and interpret it that way, whether the outcome is favorable or not. So when you see issues on the table like abortion, like healthcare, does this give you any confidence that there'll be big changes in those areas?
I don't know if there are going to be big changes, but the most important thing that it would do, in my opinion, is not any particular piece of legislation or a conservative drift to legislation. I think with this kind of a majority now, the Supreme Court will fit in the box in which it came. It'll go back into the box it came in, which is not to determine the political future of the United States of America. It is not the days of legislating from the Supreme Court are over for the foreseeable future as a result of these three appointments. And that is why this is so absolutely terrifying and detrimental to the Democrats. They talk about the abortion issue, which is undoubtedly their primary concern. But what they're really terrified of is they will no longer have this lever to overturn legislation they don't like and to create legislation that they do. So putting the Supreme Court back in its appropriate box, having the weight it's supposed to have relative to the other two branches of government, and taking it away from the idea that if we can just convince 5 Americans to vote on something, we can get anything we want. That's the primary importance. Now, of course, if Trump loses the election, or if he's already lost it due to early voting, then which I doubt, by the way, then the question becomes: will the Democrats pack the court as a result of this? And it seems to me the fact that they will not rule it out tells me that if Joe Biden is elected president and they capture the Senate, then they will put another 3, 5, 8, 10 justices on there, so they go back to using this thing as a cudgel.
Here's what Joe Biden said just today on that question. I was listening to the radio on my way back from my other job, and he said that he is going to convene a panel. He's mentioned this before. It'll be a panel of Supreme Court constitutional scholars. They're not going to be particularly conservative or liberal. There'll be some conservatives, some liberals, some who are in the middle, and that he will take the recommendations, or review the recommendations anyway, of that panel. So it sounds to me, Bill, like he sees this as a political hot potato that he doesn't really want to touch. And if there's anything politicians have learned, is that if you appoint a blue ribbon commission, it sounds like you're doing something.
I do have to say, and I certainly don't put it past them, but I do have to say that I find it virtually inconceivable that even if you were to put together a committee of nothing but Ruth Bader Ginsburg's, 10 of them, I find it almost inconceivable to think that they would agree to packing the court, that they would agree to the idea of adding Supreme Court justices because you're outvoted, because we're outvoted now, because the court leads conservative instead of liberal. We're going to appoint more justices so we can get our liberal majority back. I cannot see a single Supreme Court justice or anybody who has any understanding of the law. Forget their politics. We're talking about we're probably talking about the most important non-specified precedent in the Constitution. This is the most important thing in our government that is not actually defined by the Constitution. Number of justices on the Supreme Court. And it has been steady at 9 for, 150 years now or something, or more. It would be inconceivable for me to see what justices or legal authorities would say, yes, it's definitely time to do that, without them all being complete partisan hacks. So maybe this is Biden's way of saying, no, I won't pack the court. I'm just not going to admit to it now. But that would be a destruction of the checks and balances system of government. And if they decided that, well, the law says the president appoints Supreme Court nominees and they're approved by the Senate. And that process has been working for 150 years or more. And now finally, the conservatives have used that system legitimately and now we're out of power. So we're going to change the rules. I think that would be the grounds for an extraordinarily serious constitutional crisis.
Bill, how many people do you think among the conservative movement? I mean, you and I have just expressed a view basically of what a conservative, so-called conservative justice does. It's really a textualist, an originalist, and somebody who reads the actual text and interprets it in the context of what the text meant at the time that it was, voted in as legislation, or at the time it was ratified if it's in the Constitution. Do you think that the vast majority of Republicans or conservatives are really thinking that way? Or are they more thinking, great, we got another conservative in there, now we'll get the kind of legislation from the bench we like?
No, I can't think of any conservatives who would be thinking that way. I know
that's the way the liberals think we think, though, isn't it?
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Everything that the liberals think about us is false. The liberals project all of their own motives onto us. And all of their worst motives onto us, and that's what they assume. But I haven't spoken to a Republican or a conservative, not one, who's ever said, boy, now's our chance to, if we get this, we can go in there and we can start screwing the left the way we've been screwed by them over the course of the last 60 years. Every one of them that I've spoken to, whoever talks about this, basically says, good. Now we can have a Supreme Court that determines whether a law passed by the people is unconstitutional within an extremely narrow confines of, is it actually in violation of the Constitution? No social considerations, no idea of like a higher justice. Is this law forbidden by the Constitution? Yes or no? And by the way, the Supreme Court doesn't just rule on constitutional issues. The Supreme Court is the ultimate highest court in the land. So you can assume that a number of conservative type things like the respect for private property and the ability to have your Second Amendment rights not taken away from you and so on, your Fifth Amendment rights, your rights against search and seizure, all of those things. That's all great. And frankly, I think on reflection, this is probably the most important thing because I suspect that the great issue after this election, if Donald Trump wins and we maintain the Senate, I suspect that the number one issue will be the issue of big tech and breaking up that monopoly. And I think that the argument that big tech is in violation of the amendment that protects us in our privacy for our records and against unreasonable search and seizure and so on. I think that would be an argument that the court would respond to if they're filled with originalists who respect the Constitution the way it's written. The big issue is the most important issue is a disputed election. That's right now. If you want to know what's most important about Ms. Barrett being on the court, it's the contested election. In 2000, we had a contested election, and the idea behind the Democrats was, as it's always been, you lost the mechanical count by a narrow margin, you're entitled to a recount. You lost that mechanical count too. And then you start finding ways to get around the fact that you lost, and you lost the recount. So we had the hanging chads and the committees of Republicans and Democrats and guys holding the thing up and all of it. And finally, George Bush became president. If you listen to the left, they'll say that the Supreme Court declared George Bush the president, but that's not what happened. The Supreme Court said that the electors must be in Washington at the time of the vote of the Electoral College, and you don't get to keep extending until you find enough votes. Well, we are going to find ourselves with a contested election one way or another. And
I wonder about that, Bill, because it just occurs to me that if they had if they had an 8-member Supreme Court, and you've got John Roberts as one of those members going up with a 4-4 potential there, or, John Roberts voting with the liberals on the court as he has all too often. I think having Amy Coney Barrett on the court at this point almost says to the Democrats, don't waste your time.
It. Yes, that's precisely exactly correct. The fact that the confirmation of this justice prior to the election is essential. And one of the reasons the Democrats tried so hard to block it is because if they had blocked it, if Donald Trump had agreed to it and the Republicans had agreed to it, which, to be perfectly honest with you, Scott, I think probably that was exactly what would have happened if they hadn't assassinated Brett Kavanaugh the way they had. But that changed a lot of minds. And so the last thing you want is to go into a disputed election with a Supreme Court that splits 4-4. Now you are genuinely out of options. What do you do then? And you're right. A 6-3 majority on the court is insurmountable. Any legitimate. Now I'm talking about legitimate. I'm not talking about a case where Donald Trump may have actually lost, but any legitimate indication Donald Trump won the election, and any sort of legerdemain and recounts and all this other non-constitutional stuff, I think is preemptively off the table because they know that they're just going to make a lot of fuss, take a bigger hit among the American people, and lose it anyway.
Now, I want to get your quick opinion on this, because all day long, as I heard news or as I read news, they were the folks on the left were basically saying now there'll be a 6-3 conservative majority. And I kept thinking, oh, if only the conservative might say, do we really think we've got a 6-3 conservative majority on the court? That's not the John Roberts I know.
Correct. John Roberts is not Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but John Roberts is hardly pillar of conservatism and original intent upon which to build your republic. But the good news is that on most issues, we'll have a 6-3 majority, and on the critical issues, we'll have a 5-4 majority, and a majority is all that matters. And this is profoundly important because we are going to be heading into some very difficult times in the days and weeks following the election, especially if Trump wins this election. And if he doesn't win the election, I think you could make a compelling case that the election was stolen through things like the fact that legitimate news stories have been banned. They've simply been shut down. It's like it's almost like, it's like I want to call you and tell you about something that I heard on the news, and the telephone company shuts down your call because they don't want that call to get through. That's what we saw with this Hunter Biden email thing. And so one way or another, it's going to be a mess. It's going to be ugly. And the only way it's good, and the only way to make it the least ugly is for the upstream swimming salmon, that'd be us, to put out such a monumental win that there's really no way to fake it, it really becomes beyond question. And if it turns out that this entire idea, it seems to me that the idea of if they want to abolish the Electoral College and so on, that's not a Supreme Court decision. That's a constitutional amendment. Same thing for admission of new states and all the rest of it. That all has to be ratified by all the states, not just something somebody can sign into law. And so all of these things are great. And it removes the shortcut that the left has been able to take to get around all of these structural constitutional mechanisms designed to limit power. That's probably the best way to think of it. The way the Constitution is designed to limit political power and designed to keep social changes relatively slow. It can be moved, but it can't be moved in a panic. They were terrified of a full democracy in that regard, and they had plenty of reason to be too. And so imagine this whole thing as a circuit breaker. And what the left has been doing is they've been using the Supreme Court to basically circuit break themselves around all of these checks and balances, including the Supreme Court. Well, those days are over now, and they will be over for the foreseeable future. And as Barack Obama said, memorably, elections have consequences. And this is one of the consequences of the election of 2016. And for those people on the left who are so absolutely hyperventilating about this, you may want to have had talk with Ruth Bader Ginsburg back when she was only 103 or whatever, before Donald Trump won that election. But the reason she didn't resign was because everybody knew that Hillary Clinton was going to win the 2016 election because it had been ordained by the elites that she would win the election. And imagine their surprise.
The members of BillWhittle.com have made this program possible in some 40 programs every month. We appreciate their generosity and we invite you to join them. You can go to BillWhittle.com and click that big green Become a Member button. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.